Hey guys, welcome to your study of the unit or chapter called Federal Power, the Crisis of Authority. In this unit we've been studying U.S. involvement in foreign affairs such as the war, World War II, and then following that we looked at U.S. society and how the economy improved after the war and how people viewed themselves in relation to the world as an affluent society. And close to the end of the 50s, the children who were born to the greatest generation, these baby boomers, have been given so much and been told so much that their possibilities are endless that they do start to actually believe that, and then that leads into them questioning authority. And their questioning of authority is assisted by some serious failures of the federal government through the 60s and 70s, and that's kind of what this section is all about. The people, the youth group, the youth movement questioning just exactly how powerful their government is and just exactly how positive the role of their government is in foreign activities as well as domestic. Here's our objectives for this chapter. We'll look at this new group of people called the New Left or the Counterculture. We'll look at how Johnson takes Kennedy's domestic policies and expands it into what's known as the Great Society. And then again, how American foreign policy has affected the perception of U.S. citizens. The country's role, the U.S. government role, expands, obviously. After World War II, we realized that there is no possible way we can ever go back to a period of neutrality or isolation, and so we stay involved, and we do become a major contributor and a major player in the new organization called the United Nations. The United Nations replaces the defunct League of Nations following World War I. The idea of Woodrow Wilson that there should be a governing body for the world, actually a great idea. Unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson, the United States government did not see it necessary that the United States belong to that organization. So the League of Nations works for a short period of time, but eventually there's no real power behind it, so it fails. Then we see World War II, and then following the defeat of Germany in World War II, we have the creation of the United Nations. And so the U.S. is involved in that world affair, and it becomes a major player in that. But there's a lot of issues and a lot of problems that follow as a result. Domestically, here at home, the federal government takes its role as not necessarily a police power, but someone who is overseeing the lives of the people of the world and other countries of the world, and applies the same principle at home. And so the United States becomes a major part of the people's well-being and the welfare, the social welfare of the people, of the U.S. citizens. Let's go back and just a quick recap of government involvement in the lives of the United States citizens, since this is what we're heading into in this chapter. During the Civil War, the split in the North and the South allowed for radical Northern Republicans to essentially control the government. And following the Civil War, with the defeat of the South, that northern radical government essentially controls all aspects of life in the South, also in the North, but mainly in the South. They assert their supreme position over the states, and they pass basically any law they want to because they all agree, and there's no one to disagree with them. There's no Democrats in office to disagree, because it was a slow process to get Democrats back into office in D.C. So at that time, the radical Republican controlled every aspect. Now that takes us up into the industrial era of the United States, the Second Industrial Revolution around 1870. At that time, the United States has essentially rejoined, or maybe around 1880, has essentially rejoined. The Northern Republicans have pulled the military out of the South, and the South is now once again in charge of their own Reconstruction. And that opens up a period of almost 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South. But the government, the northern government, is not willing to step in and do anything to stop that, mainly because of the Compromise of 1877 and how the Republicans were able to keep control of the presidency. This is also the time period of an enormous economic and industrial boom, and the government has taken a stance of laissez-faire to pull themselves out and let the capitalists, the industrialists, run their business as they see fit. Moving into the progressive era, we start to see a little bit more government involvement. It's still, for the most part, hands-off, but as we move through the progressive era and into the 1920s, the government is starting to regulate a little bit more. Then we jump into World War I, and government takes over the economy for the success of the war effort. Following that, the government attempts to relinquish a little bit of power, and as a result, once again, the industries, the captains of industries and stock market and the wealthy kind of have their reign, and then we have the Great Depression. President Hoover does not believe that it's the government's role to regulate the social welfare of the people. He said that's a state and local issue, and because of that, he's been labeled as someone who's not willing to help the people during the Great Depression. And then in comes Franklin Delano Roosevelt with his New Deal programs, and he firmly believes it's the federal government's role and institutes a very, very strong hand of federal government over every aspect of society. The government becomes essentially the employer during the Great Depression era. Following that, we see World War II, and again, government taking over essentially the economy to ensure the success of the war effort in manufacturing. There's an enormous expansion in the size of the federal budget, but at the same time, our gross national product increases, and there's just an enormous amount of wealth and success in the economy. And because of that, we see success in World War II, and because of that, there's a pretty good faith in the United States government that they can virtually do anything within their power, and it's going to be for the betterment of the people. That takes us into the 60s. Through the 1950s, this affluent society, this fairly good faith in the federal government to take care of its people, leads us into the 1960s. President Kennedy's foreign policy and domestic policies are being spoken about. Unfortunately, due to the assassination, Kennedy is not able to see his policies carried out, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, does carry out Kennedy's policies, but takes it a step further and creates what's called the Great Society. And this is a major expansion of the government in the economy, essentially creating a welfare state. Now, they call it a war on poverty, but unlike Teddy Roosevelt's square deal, where everyone will be given an equal opportunity if that person is willing to take the initiative to earn that opportunity, Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty is nothing more than a bunch of handouts for people who apparently can't take care of themselves, and it creates a true welfare-dependent society, dependent on government. We see a lot of federal government being seen as a shield to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. And people begin to become very dependent on the federal government. Here's a nice little grid of Kennedy's plans and Johnson's plan. Kennedy's plan, the New Frontier, he could not see that fulfilled because of the assassination. Johnson does carry that out. Kennedy wanted a civil rights bill passed, which bans discrimination. Johnson sees that through. Kennedy had an Economic Opportunities Act. Johnson signs that into law, but then Johnson expands upon that. Johnson has a Jobs Corps program created, which gives vocational training to young people. He creates a Head Start program for people of disadvantaged economy. He creates a group called Volunteers in Service to America, essentially a domestic Peace Corps group that creates in one area specifically volunteer teachers to help people in impoverished regions. Johnson goes on to create the Wilderness Protection Act, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Medicare, Immigration, Air and Water Quality Act. So we see a huge involvement of the federal government in the everyday lives of the people, especially in the economy, all for the purpose of attacking poverty, try to wipe out poverty. Unfortunately, it doesn't work the way Johnson had hoped, or the way Johnson had claimed it would hope. So in the 1970s, because of everything that's happens in the 60s, which we'll get to, because of that, we see a resurgence of a conservative movement, and these new conservatives start to claim and see the government as a barrier instead of a shield. Instead of helping people, you're actually hindering people. You're creating a society of dependence, and so the conservative movement starts to oppose that. There is a declining faith, again, through the 60s, 1960s, a declining faith in the ability of the government. Again, we can't protect our own president. He's assassinated in Dallas. Vietnam is a huge failure. We go in, a lot of people oppose the fact that we're even there. It's not even a declared war. Johnson's Great Society plan fails miserably. It does not do really anything to reduce poverty or any kind of racial tension, as the Equal Opportunities Act had hoped for. Again, the United States pulls out of Vietnam, so there's that loss, and then we see our president, Nixon, lying to us in the Watergate scandal. Vietnam, now that the United States is gone, falls to communism. The whole reason we were there, to stop the spread of communism. Eventually we fail and communism takes over Vietnam, and then we jump into the 80s with Ronald Reagan, who was supposed to be this new conservative president and supposed to lead the way into a better society for us. We find out that people in his administration are helping out some rebels down in Nicaragua, and the money from the sale of those weapons falls into the hands. It's just a big mess. And even though this chapter doesn't go into the modern day 2000 period, it's important to note, along the lines of all these other seemingly failed presidencies that we mentioned, the Clinton scandals of 2000. So overall, we just see people losing faith in their government. It's a big shift from the 1950s, where people believe the government can do anything. The government is basically leading the way for the people, to now, the government's just in the way, and you can't trust the government. So that's what we're looking at here, this crisis of authority. So the resurgence, or the surgence, the growth of what we call this new left. These are the baby boomers. They go off to college in the 60s, and again, these are the kids who've been told that they can do anything, and they have that mentality. Why can't we do anything? We've been told we can do anything. Why can't we? But all along, they're facing this barrier of authority that says, no, you can't do that. So this raises a group of radicals, rebellious youth that comes to be known as the New Left, primarily made up of white men and women, college-age kids, not necessarily communists, but they do embrace theories of communism, the theories of challenging the established system. This group takes lessons from the civil rights movement and uses strategies of parades and sit-ins and protests to get their message across. Berkeley becomes a major hub of protests, but also across the country and other major universities such as Harvard and Columbia. And they use their idea of free speech to claim the right to protest as they do. Vietnam is probably one of the most contested issues of this time period. We see a lot of draft dodging, a lot of draft card burning, very vicious protests in public, people escaping to Canada or escaping overseas to dodge the draft. Just a complete lack of faith in the government's ability to protect the citizens. If we can't protect our own presidents, how can you protect me, just an ordinary citizen, is the mind thought. This counterculture, these kids, the college-age kids, the baby boomers, create what we call a counterculture. They openly scorn the values of the middle class. Essentially, they scorn the values that they were raised in of their parents. Materialism. In the 50s we are a consumer culture. In the 60s and 70s, these kids are criticizing that, saying they were too materialistic. They change their entire physical appearance, long hair and shabby clothing, and start using a new language called hippie language. And I'm sure just imagine, the Scooby-Doo character. Hey, dude, what's up? And everything's cool. That's the new language of this counterculture. A very wide open public use of marijuana, a huge revolution in the area of sex and just promiscuity. And there's a new creed. The first responsibility of the individual is the cultivation of the self, the unleashing of one's own full potential for pleasure and fulfillment. Basically, do whatever's good for you and forget about everything else. We see this as part of how these children were raised. They've been taught that you can do anything you want to, and so now as teenagers and young adults, they're carrying this out. The hippie style eventually bleeds into the remainder of society, and even those not associated with hippies start to take on some of those characteristics, especially the smoking of marijuana and listening to rock and roll. The culmination, probably what every hippie associates themselves with, is Woodstock, this major musical festival. It takes on an angry tone. The rock and roll takes on an angry tone. The music of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, and they're lashing out at government and they're lashing out in criticisms of government involvement in Vietnam. A lot of music at this time is used to rebel against the government and to speak out against what the government is doing. Things that the baby boomers live through, things that these young adults are facing, and basically these failures of the United States government is fueling the fire of the hippie movement. In 72, there's a loss in Vietnam. We pull out of Vietnam, and in 1973, the United States experiences their very first shock in the oil business by having an oil embargo placed on the United States by Arab states. The reason the oil embargo was placed on the United States is because the U.S. supported Israel in the Yom Kippur Wars. And so the Arab states who oppose Israel realize the United States is somewhat dependent on them for their oil, and so they try to force us into not supporting Israel. Well, we were able to make it through that first oil embargo, only to see 1975 see South Vietnam fall to communism, and then in 1979 there's a changing of the guard in Iran, and that leads to the second oil crisis in 1979. It's also the same year as the American hostage crisis in Iran. The reason this all takes place is because the Shah of Iran abdicates his throne as the leader of the country, and a religious zealot steps in. The Ayatollah Khomeini steps in, and oil production almost comes to a halt. Again, the new religious leader of Iran tries to force the United States into submission by halting the production of oil because of our reliance on Iranian oil. So if you look at this line graph here, 1979, Iranian oil drops significantly from 79 to 80. Huge decrease in the millions of barrels per day. We're about 5, maybe 5.5 barrels a day in Iran at the beginning of 79, and by 1980 we're down below 2 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabian oil is producing more than Iranian oil, but even there we see a decrease in that 1 year from 79 to 80. The United States oil is producing more than Saudi Arabia and Iran until that period. The United States dips below Saudi Arabia, but if you look at that time period, the United States oil is actually increasing, and that's because the oil we're getting from Iran and Saudi Arabia is not available. So we have to increase our own oil production. And then, of course, we are in the middle of the Cold War at this time, and there's no way we are buying oil from Russia. Russia production continues to increase throughout this time period, and but we're not involved in any kind of business with Russia, so it makes no difference how much they're producing. Again, 1979, the American hostage crisis in Iran, due to our support of the Shah of Iran.
This night in Washington.
Sorry about that. Due to our support of the Shah of Iran, 53 American hostages, or excuse me, 53 American workers in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, are taken hostages by the new religious groups who are now in charge of Iran. And they are essentially held hostage for an entire year. This is during the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and he is unable to get those hostages released. Now, I don't know how good the volume is going to be on this video, and I'm going to watch maybe, 30 to 60 seconds of this with you right now, and then I'll stop it. And if it's interesting enough to you, then go back to just the regular Prezi and watch it there where the volume would be better, and you can pause and start on your own.
Here tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now, but throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today. In this broadcast, we'll have reports on the diplomatic efforts to resolve the problem and on other aspects of the crisis as well.
Okay, that's good enough for that. So again, if that's interesting enough to you, then I encourage you to go back to the regular Prezi and to watch this on your own. Not exactly a Ron Burgundy type anchorman, but it is the same time of Ron Burgundy, the famous anchorman from San Diego. And then finally, the 1986, we jump ahead a few years. Again, just to show you the people's reasoning for their lack of faith in the government. And in 1986, the Iran-Contra affair. The volume of this video and the length of this video is entirely too long for us to view here. Again, watch the Prezi. I particularly enjoy watching this YouTube video because this is the trial of Colonel Oliver North. He's on trial for his participation in the Iran-Contra affairs. And Oliver North is a huge conservative today. And Oliver North is very open and honest with this Senate investigation committee. And I think that's what irritates the committee the most, is that he is so open and honest that he answers every question that they ask him to. They're almost expecting him to cover everything up, and he's very blatant and very open and honest. So, good stuff there. As the time moves on, we see the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and around the 1980s, a conservative movement is on the rise. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the election of Ronald Reagan, the mindset of the American public starts to change. China's still a concern because we become essentially a multipolar world. The idea that there were at one time two major powers, and that would be a bipolar system where there's, the United States is one pole and Russia is another pole. And then those two countries hold the power essentially over the entire world, and they're at odds against each other. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of China, the Soviet Union is no longer in existence. It's now back to being called Russia, and now it becomes multipolar. So it's the United States, Soviet Union, and other powers. Again, this changing idea that maybe the United States can recover itself to become the once great nation. Domestic issues, again, we see the end of the post-war boom. In the 70s, inflation kicks in, late 60s, high oil prices because of the embargoes of 1973 and 1979. The 70s, they look like a midlife crisis for the United States after such a great and wonderful time in the 50s. How can things go so bad in the 70s? The faith in the government is shaken. And again, that leads to a rise in a conservative movement in the United States in the 1980s. And that will lead us into our very last unit of the semester. Thanks, guys.